Good morning and welcome to today's presentation on threat detection, reducing the time to detect and contain cyber incidents. My name is Jen and I will be your moderator for today's webinar. This presentation will be presented by Brian Nolan. Brian is the Chief Technology Officer for the Advanced Threat Center of Excellence at TUV Rhineland Group. He is responsible for global strategy and development of the company's managed threat detection services. A specialist in cybersecurity, Brian has over 20 years of experience helping organizations understand and protect themselves from cyber threats. Brian previously led OpenSky's Global Security Services as Practice Director. He has also held leadership roles in several consulting organizations focused on delivery of security and risk management professional services to clients across diverse industries. For today's presentation, each of you is in listen-only mode. We encourage you all to submit questions via the chat box function. Questions will be answered during a Q&A at the end of the presentation if time permits. Also, please note that the presentation is available for download as a PDF in the handouts section. At this time, I'd like to turn things over to Brian. Brian, please go ahead.
Thank you, Jen. Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining. Today, I'm going to be talking about a risk-based approach to threat detection and how that can be used to reduce the time to detect and contain cyber incidents. So I thought I'd start with a high-level overview of the very exciting times that we live in as far as threat detection. So in the offensive zone, we have a tremendous growth of cybercrime with, reports estimating that's going to hit 6 billion by 2020. Clearly, adversaries and cyber criminals have recognized the value of our data and are investing in new ways to attack and gain access to our systems and data for financial gain. Add to that a very rapidly expanding attack surface that we're using more data in more ways, mobile devices, the Internet of Things, operational technologies, cloud, and new ways to deploy applications are all adding to more attack surface that the adversaries have to go after. On top of that, we've seen, as everyone's seen, a huge increase in ransomware, and beyond that, attack automation, which is presenting from challenges from a defense point of view, and really diverse adversaries. Besides cybercrime, we've got, different adversaries with all sorts of different motives that we have to protect against. And lastly, at the high level is, as we all see in the news, increasing geopolitical threats. So on the defensive side, we've got sort of a mix. We've got some real positives with board and senior management level awareness and support, and really budget and investment in protecting our data, which is great. A lot of new and innovative security products available to us to employ to defend our data and our systems. We've got great emerging technologies, some of which I'll talk about in this webinar, at our disposal. But at the same time, the rapidly expanding attack surface is presenting some challenges from a defense point of view. There's a serious shortage of cybersecurity talent, in particular in some of the areas that we'll talk about today, as far as data scientists and analytics and threat monitoring. And the big one is really just a poor historical global performance when it comes to cyber detection and response. If you look at the latest Ponemon Institute publications, they're showing the mean time to identify security incidents as over 190 days, with another 66 days beyond that as the mean time to contain incidents, which really is, as global averages are just terrible. So clearly we can do a better job at detection and response. So some of the opportunities we have, to improve the time it takes to detect and contain incidents are summarized here. And big data analytics really is at the top of the list. There's some technology now, that wasn't previously available to us before, really born out of social media and the desire and need to rapidly query and analyze large sets of unstructured data that, when applied to security, are proving to be tremendously beneficial from a threat detection point of view. And there's also, a recognized need now for sort of technology convergence in security operations for better single visibility across, all of our data and all of our systems, especially with, taking on the security tools and technology that we have and bringing them together for a single view, and not having disparate security systems that we have to monitor separately. And big data analytics platforms are a great way to sort of bring it all together and get a single view, especially when you start leveraging the performance and scalability of the cloud for those technologies. In addition to that, there's some emerging technologies on top of big data analytics that we can leverage in the form of machine learning and behavior anomaly detection. Now, machine learning and artificial intelligence, unfortunately, isn't at the point where it's going to, do all the work for us, solve all our problems. Marketing would like you to believe for some of the vendors out there. But what it is very good at is, if we understand specific behaviors that we want to monitor and why deviations to those behaviors would be interesting to us from a threat detection perspective. The technology is at a point now where we can learn, we can use the machine learning to have it understand, specific behaviors and point out outliers and anomalies to those behaviors, and we can leverage that to good effect. So we'll talk about that a bit. And then, enhanced use of threat intelligence is another opportunity. Threat intelligence got hot a few years ago, and a lot of organizations haven't really recognized the value that they expected from that threat intelligence, and big data analytics and some emerging technologies around how we can bring threat intelligence in and correlate it across all of our data is presenting some great opportunities to use it better. Visibility into IoT and OT, Internet of Things and operational technology, is something that a lot of organizations are lacking right now from a threat detection perspective. And there's opportunities to look at behavior-based analytics and using the information that's available from these technologies, even if they don't generate traditional logs or traditional security logs, and how the data that is available might be correlated with other data and put to good use to our purposes for threat detection. And last but not least, certainly, is really the topic of this presentation, or the heart of this presentation, which is risk-aligned threat detection and focusing detection on top risks and accelerating investigation and response and reporting on capabilities and operational metrics. And this is what I'm going to talk about today in the form of the methodology for, how do we go about understanding the top organizational risks, or what's most important to the organization from a risk perspective, and aligning our threat detection to those risks. So the methodology that we use for that is presented in this slide, and it's pretty straightforward. We identify the top risks. This might come in the form of an enterprise risk register. If the organization has a mature risk management program, we could expect to see an enterprise risk register with top risks already identified and well structured in risk statements. If that isn't the case, or those aren't available for some reason to leverage for our purposes, we'll talk in the next couple of slides about how we can create that. And that could be in the form of something very specific to the organization, or something that's more industry aligned, an industry risk profile. In either case, we identify the top risks, then we define the most likely attack scenarios related to those risks. We don't have to define every possible attack scenario. What we want to do is understand, what are the top attack scenarios that we're worried about, and from there we can look in detail at the specific threat activities related to those attacks that are aligned to our key risks, so that we're in a position to move on and develop analytics for each of the threat activities across the attack chain. Those analytics that we develop, we'll find that many of them are broader, even though we're building them and aligning them to a specific activity related to a risk. Those analytics then prove to be beneficial for other risk statements and for risks and other attacks that we may not have thought of or that we haven't gotten around to mapping out yet. And what we're really doing is kind of building, a foundation and a baseline, or expanding our foundation if one exists, so that we're building out a complete threat detection capability. But we're really using this approach to prioritize how we do that. And then we move on to monitoring, investigating, and responding to threat activity, utilizing those analytics, and lastly, capturing metrics and informing GRC and risk management. And we'll talk about that a little bit. So I'm going to walk through this process, and we'll start with identifying top risks. The example that I'm going to use in this presentation is for a healthcare delivery organization. So the way that I like to go about doing this, in the example that I'm going to give, if we don't have a risk register at our disposal and we want to create, a list of prioritized top risk statements, a way that we can go about that is to start by really just identifying what are the top security concerns. So if we can talk with some stakeholders in the organization and come to a consensus on what are we most worried about from a risk perspective for the organization. So for an HDO or healthcare delivery organization, top of the list, almost always patient safety. Everyone will agree that top priority is patient safety, and we have some subsets of that. What are the things that we're worried about when it comes to patient safety? It's medical device, IoT security, it's the integrity of our healthcare data, it's the availability of our healthcare data. Number two could be availability of healthcare data and systems. Now you can see a repeat there in patient safety. That's okay. Some of the availability of healthcare data can go beyond patient safety, so it really could be its own category because it could have financial impacts that we're concerned about. And those are things like ransomware and denial of service. You can see for 3, it's breach of protected health information, or PHI, and some of the things related to that we may be concerned about are phishing and malware and vulnerable software, shadow IT, which is technology that comes into the organization that's outside the control, of enterprise IT, and insider threat. 4th is business associate security, compromised vendor or partner. And 5 is data theft of non-protected healthcare information, which would be things like research data, proprietary information, point of sale, payment information, that type of thing. So we kind of go through the exercise and we come up with kind of top 5. What are our security concerns? What are we most worried about? And from there we look at, okay, what are the threat actors and motivation related to those concerns? And we can start to group those. Nation state, clearly we hear about that all the time in the news and the capabilities. So when we think about nation state, we're worried about espionage, the theft of intellectual property. We're worried about cyber warfare in terms of sabotaging critical infrastructure as part of a political agenda, and really that critical infrastructure could include healthcare delivery, certainly. So that would play into the HDO use case here, or threat case. Cyber crime really could be another motivation, or another one that we could list under nation state, but I like to list cyber crime as its own really threat actor motivation. The other 4 that are listed in these 5 really could all have criminal motivation in some form. So I like to group that. Hacktivists and terrorists, really looking at cyber attacks to promote either a political agenda or social change, or terrorism. And then we've got outsider and insider, which is, the outsider is anyone outside of the organization. And this might not always be malicious, in terms of an HDO. There very well could be, an outsider that's, a family member that doesn't have access to the healthcare information of someone that they're concerned about, and they're trying to get it. It could be, a euthanasia type of situation, or very well could be, simple, malicious activity. And then the insider, covers, folks that do have access, employees of the organization or someone on the inside, and that could be both intentional but also unintentional or negligent actions. So there we've defined the threat actors and the motivation. We move on to looking at, what are the cyber risk categories and kind of what falls under those categories. So, the classic cybersecurity CIA confidentiality, integrity, and availability model is expanded to safety, to include safety, which really, we're seeing as sort of a fundamental addition across all industries now, with the rise of IoT and sort of the integration of physical devices with technology. There's almost always a reason that has safety in here. But in particular, you would expect to see it in an HDO or healthcare organization situation. So for confidentiality, we look at protected healthcare information, financial data, research data, proprietary information. Under integrity, we're concerned about medical device functionality, clinical applications and systems, patient records, availability, a little bit of a repeat here, medical device functionality, clinical apps, patient records. And then under safety, we have medical device functionality. So it's okay to sort of repeat and group some of these together. They're going to have a lot of overlap. So we've defined this. We move on and we take a look at what are the major asset classes. What do we have? What do we need to protect? And we come up with a list. And we'll read through all these, but you can see on the screen we've got things like active and passive medical devices, and all the way down to IT networking, IT security technology. So now that we understand the security concerns, the threat actors and motivation, the risk categories, and the major asset types, we're prepared to create top risk statements. Risk statements are typically constructed as scenarios with threats to assets and impacts, and are typically written, in a single sentence, very easy to understand from a business context. I like to present them, for the purpose of threat detection and how we're going to align to threat activity, in the form of a target, which is typically an asset or a type of data, followed by an event, which is the cause or the threat, followed by the result, which is the effect, and lastly, the consequence or the impact. So you can see that in these statements, I've kind of color coded so we can see the breakdown. And at the top of the list is critical data is encrypted in a ransomware attack, disrupting healthcare delivery operations, resulting in permanent injury or significant financial loss, permanent injury or death or significant financial loss. So that's sort of the breakdown of the structure of the risk statement. And as I know it's a lot on the screen right now. I wanted to put sort of a top 10 up here so you could get a feel for sort of the diversity of some of these that might appear. But as we take a look at these, you'll find that there's varying levels of detail, or how broad the risk statement is written. Can vary quite a bit, right? We've got things on here like number 3 where PHI is breached, exposing confidential information, resulting in financial loss. That's very broad, right? That could cover quite a bit. And we'll talk a little bit later about how we might break that down a little bit. And then at the same time, 4 and 5, we've got an active medical device is modified to fail to deliver the necessary treatment or deliver the incorrect medicine or incorrect dosage. And then a separate one for an AMD is modified to cause harm, such as delivering electrical shock or emitting radiation. Those could certainly be combined. Number 4 could even be broken out into 2 separate ones. And that's okay. It doesn't have to be, necessarily, perfectly consistent. And what we'll find is when we look at, enterprise risk registers, if they exist, they're often written, in a lot of different ways. And again, you won't always see the structure. In fact, a lot of times organizations like to add the adversary. We talked about, sort of the different categories of a nation state, an insider versus an outsider. So often you'll see, the adversary and the motivation put in there as well. And what happens there is you start to get a lot of repeats, right? If you're looking at PHI is breached, it could be a nation state breaches, PHI, and an insider breaches PHI as separate risk statements. I just generally prefer to leave the threat actor out and address it as part of detection, because a lot of times the detection is going to cover both in the same way. So this is sort of the look at how we construct risk statements, and then how we prioritize these statements is the topic of the next slide. And there's many ways to prioritize risk. This particular example, we've certainly used to good effect, and ones like it where we use a scoring method and we consider controls and residual risk. So if you look at this one, there's a particular risk statement. We look at the impact of that risk and we give it a scoring in terms of the CIAS model. Then we look at the likelihood and we give that scoring in terms of the means, motive, and opportunity. That results in inherent risk. We then look at, what are the controls, related to this risk, and how does that reduce the inherent risk to a residual risk? And we end up with a scoring. And if we score our risk statements, we can look to prioritize them. You don't have to, go through this level of detail, and really, a lot of organizations will do it in different ways. And the model and complexity is really based on the maturity of the risk management program. You could simply, take your list of risk statements and, bring some subject matter experts, some stakeholders together and say, okay, what do we think is the most, the ones with the most risk, and let's just, do a consensus on priority. You could look at impact and likelihood, without going down and trying to break out, confidentiality and integrity and safety, and just say, what do we think the impact is? Is it high, medium, or low? Is it 5-point scale? What do we think the likelihood is? Or just impact. So there's a lot of ways that you can do, the prioritization. And the important thing is to understand what are the top risks we're concerned about and have some priority around them so that we can use that to drive threat detection in a way that benefits us. So the next step in this process, now that we've gotten to the risk statement and understanding and prioritizing risk, is to define the related attack scenarios. The example that I'll give here is the first one in the list, which was the ransomware attack. Critical data is encrypted in a ransomware attack. So this one's pretty straightforward because it actually, in the statement itself, talks about the type of attack, right? It's a ransomware attack that we're worried about. So if we were going to give attack scenarios for ransomware, we could come up with a list of, the different ways that ransomware attacks occur, right? We have phishing attack with a malicious email attachment. We've got a phishing attack with a malicious email link, a vulnerability in an internet-facing system, or a vulnerability, on a laptop on an untrusted network, compromised vendor or partner through a software update or a network trust relationship, a malicious insider with intention, and the list can go on. So, when we look to create this list of attack scenarios, one of the things we want to consider is what are the sort of tactics and techniques of the past related to these types of attacks, right? So if you look at ransomware attacks, email attachment, geez, one of the first ones, right? CryptoLocker back in 2013. If you look at vulnerability on internet-facing systems, WannaCry comes to mind, right? NSA's external blue exploit, SMB port 445 open to the internet. 2018, the the Atlanta attacks recently, SamSam ransomware, right? That was a vulnerability in Java-based servers. Compromised vendor or partner, software update, NotPetya was accounting software package used by many companies in the Ukraine that was a point of origin. So as we look back, and think about, how have we seen these attacks occur in the past, that can really help us with, defining some attack scenarios. As I said earlier, we don't need to define every attack scenario. What we want to do is, identify some top attack scenarios so that we can then go through the process of, looking at, well, what are the threat activities related to these attack scenarios? And as we build out, detection capabilities for those specific activities, what we find is those activities start to apply to a lot of different types of attacks. Beyond this particular scenario and beyond this particular risk. And there's a lot of benefits to going through the exercise to do this, for one attack scenario or several attack scenarios related to risk that apply beyond that risk. And then the other advice I'll give here is when you're talking about coming up with attack scenarios, is work with the ethical hacking teams at your disposal or SMEs in the organization or partners. And get some help and get creative with understanding ways that this can happen. And then the last point I think I'll make here is consider breaking out separate scenarios if the risk statement is too broad. So I talked earlier about that PHI is breached example. That's a lot to come up with attack scenarios on how PHI can be breached, right? Because PHI can exist in a lot of different places, and you start getting a little overwhelmed to think like, oh man, there's I could think of hundreds of attack scenarios for PHI, right? So it helps if the risk statement is too broad to potentially break it out into some sub-risk statements, right? Identify where PHI resides, and create some unique scenarios, right? Maybe you've got a customer application exposed to the internet with PHI that you're concerned about. You can make a risk statement around that, or some attack scenarios specifically related to, well, how would that application be, most likely attacked if we were concerned about that? Or maybe you're using SharePoint in the cloud, Office 365. You've got some data in there that you're concerned about. And say, let's focus on SharePoint and talk about that as a risk, and what are the attack scenarios, top attack scenarios that are related to accessing PHI in SharePoint. So there's opportunity to sort of break this down a little further if we need to. So that's moving on to, now that we understand some attack scenarios, let's get into the details of really understanding and mapping the threat activities related to those scenarios. I use the term threat activities here. Really, attack activities is another way to look at it. As we're doing threat detection and we want to build detection around these activities, I just like the terminology better. But they're really the specific activities, that are related to the attack scenario. And there's a lot of models available to assist us with this. The best way that we can do it is to define the threat activities by attack phase and break it down a little bit, so we can look at different models that we might want to leverage to talk about the phases of the attack and the different activities that would occur. So cyber kill chain's one of them. You can see the different phases here. CIS community attack model is another we see used a lot. MITRE ATT&CK is a fantastic one. I'm going to talk about this one a little bit more because out of all of these, it really provides a level of detail that the others do not, as far as being populated across the different categories with more information. And cyber threat framework, that's another one that's a U.S. government, that's published by the Office of the Director of National Intelligence. Or you might, create your own custom model. I actually like to use a very simple one, kind of a 4-point one, which I guess would be, somewhat aligned to the cyber threat framework in that it just has 4. The way I've often done it is, recon discovery is 1, a combination of recon and discovery, actual exploitation as a 2nd, post-exploitation activity as a 3rd, and for post-exploitation, I use the ATT&CK model for post-exploitation activity, and then 4 is execute objectives. So it's recon, discovery, exploit, post-exploit, and execute objectives. And that has worked for me. But really, any of these models can work, and these are just, a few sample models. There's actually more available if you want to go and find them and utilize them. But the idea is, understand, the different categories. And one other thing I'll touch on here is you can see there is some color coding here. Some of these are in red. So you may have picked up, where the delineation is. It's in post-exploitation activity is red, right? So some of these go up and include, a point of a phase that's actual exploitation, and then we move into post-exploitation activity. And the reason I color-coded these is really to highlight that the ATT&CK model is all post-exploitation activity. So if you're going to use that model, we need to, think about building on top of it and looking beyond just post-exploitation activity. MITRE is actually, working on and really has released the first instance, although I think it needs to be built out a little more of what they're calling pre-ATT&CK, as well as they've got one for mobile. This is the enterprise one. And also, what we'll find is we look into that one a little more is that specific one, ATT&CK post-exploitation is based on, the populated version is based on Windows, Linux, and Mac. So if we look to leverage the information that's available in there, those are the platforms that it covers. However, the model itself, the phases, persistence and privilege escalation, defense evasion, really can be applied to other technologies, and that's the way I like to use it, is use the framework and the categories, leverage the information there if I am looking at Windows or Linux or Mac, but beyond that I can still use the categories to build my own, because it's, it is a very robust and a good system to work with. So those are the models available. This is an example of ATT&CK. You can see that they have, these sort of tactical categories like persistence, privilege escalation, defense evasion. But then for each one, it's populated with different, different techniques and tactics, that an adversary might use, with a description, some advice around mitigation and detection. And this can all be tremendously beneficial as we go through the process of mapping out, what are the specific threat activities related to the risk that we're concerned about, or the attack scenario that we're mapping out. There's also tools available that leverage this model. One of them, which I like quite a bit, is Unfetter. This is an NSA tool that's openly available. And what this does is it allows you to sort of create and map, what are the specific activities, that are related to an intrusion set. It happens to be populated with some intrusion sets that are tied to specific threat actors. So you can see here, as an example, I just checked off APT29 and APT28. You can see that for these particular threat actors, here are the attack activities that apply to them, and the way that they typically operate, or we've seen them historically operate. So, this is an interesting point to consider too, because as we look at this model, this process that we're going through, and how we map out attack scenarios and relate them to risk, it can also be done and used for, a risk related to a threat actor. So, if you say, oh, I'm concerned about, this new threat actor that I read about or heard about through threat intelligence, and how it might apply to my organization. The methodology that we're going through here can be used to that. How does the threat actor, attack? What are the scenarios that they use, and what are the operations used as far as how they go about attacking in detail, and how can we align threat detection or evaluate our threat detection capabilities related to that. So methodology is all good for applying to threat actors the same way it applies to attack scenarios. So with that being said, I'll give just a couple examples here of, beyond the post-exploitation activities, right? If we were leveraging ATT&CK, but we wanted to, add to it with, things like recon and discovery and the exploitation phase, which aren't covered, how does that look? What are those types of descriptions or entries look like? So the attack scenario I give here is a web application. So a web application user bypasses authorization or role-based privileges. If that's the specific attack scenario that we wanted to map out. Some of the points we might list under recon and discovery would be things like an attacker spiders the application using an automated tool to map the application and catalog its contents and functionality. Attacker looks at pages that receive the path to a file as a user input and attempts to test various directory traversal, local file inclusion requests. So we're kind of putting out here sort of a brainstorm of how does the attack occur if someone's looking to bypass authorization or role-based privileges. What does the attacker normally do? And if you can work with people that do pen testing or have experience doing pen testing, ethical hacking, red teaming, this stuff's pretty second nature to them. They'll be able to come up with these lists pretty easily. Attackers systematically test access to application content and functionality should not be permitted from the current role, and the list goes on. And then for exploitation, a lot of times, we'll see exploitation being directly related, or mapped back to some of the activities for recon and discovery. So in this case, we've got, attacker accesses a file through directory traversal or file inclusion. Attacker accesses application functionality or data that's not meant to be accessed through a privilege misconfiguration or authorization flaw. So those are the types of the kind of level of detail that we would write these activities. So when we understand these threat activities or these attack activities, you can imagine it's very easy now to say, well, if I wanted to take a look at how would I detect this particular step in the process or this particular activity? There's going to be opportunity to really take a look at, and that's part of the process. Okay, if an attacker spiders the application, is that something I'll detect? Is that something I could detect? Is that something I could detect better? And that's really the process that we're going through here. We want to really just take the attack scenario, map out the activities of the attack, and evaluate our current and potential detection capabilities. And that's the process that's listed here. You document the key activities. We want to understand and document all the assets involved in the attack scenario. We want to review and document the existing detection capabilities for each activity, and then identify and prioritize the opportunities for improvement with really an eye towards analytics and behaviors that may be monitored, using behavior anomaly detection and some of the data analytics capabilities that are available to us as far as how we can improve or how we can fill gaps that exist. And from there, we're in a great position now to develop threat detection analytics, related to these specific attack activities. So when it comes to developing and documenting threat analytics, some of the key attributes that I like to capture are threat activity, a name for the analytic, a description. Very important is the key risk indicator related to that analytic. What data sources required. What's the required data specifically from those data sources. The actual analytics documented, platform specific, depending on what analytics platform you're using, typically in the form of queries. And then threat detection guidance, it's kind of optional, and notes optional. And then, lastly, very importantly, a map to the risk statement. And as we build these out and we start mapping, what particular activities tie back to which risks, it puts us in a very strong position to, start to prioritize our monitoring as we're looking at things, have better context and clarity as we're identifying threat activity, and be able to report, which I'll talk about a little bit later, back to risk management around specific activities and detection and metrics related to risk, which is hugely important for the risk management team. And then author and date. So some examples here, you can see that I've listed a threat activity as being login with compromised credential. That's part of an exploit phase. You consider that an exploit. I've logged in with compromised credentials, and here we're worried about AD login in the cloud, Azure AD login. So if this is the particular threat activity that we were concerned about detection, we might build analytics such as login from an unusual location, right? A GeoIP lookup for a successful login from an unusual location, using behavior anomaly detection, or in this case, login outside of a geographic area of a business that does not correspond with authorized work travel. That's a great one if we can get a data source for authorized work travel. In the HDO example, you might have a healthcare delivery organization that is, somewhat regional, and everyone, works at the main hospital or main campus, but then, we have folks that are, traveling and doing work elsewhere, but it's relatively limited, and it can be tracked, and we can build analytics to detect that and look up against what's authorized and what's not authorized. If that didn't exist, we might consider something like a process that tags unusual logins, and then rather than just putting them back into, okay, this is something that security operations needs to deal with. You could look to build processes and say, okay, well, maybe we can integrate employee data that maps employee to manager, and automate sending an email to the manager showing that this occurred outside unusual location, and have them verify that employee is authorized to be in that unusual location, that type of thing. Take the burden off SecOps through automation. So we can we can look at concurrent logins from separate locations. This is concurrent logins from geographically separate areas. Often find in today's world with mobile devices and stuff, we actually get a lot of concurrent logins for some types of technology. If it's things like email, you might be on your mobile phone, and you have an iPad, you're also on your work computer. Multiple logins, aren't such a rare occurrence anymore, but concurrent logins from geographically distant or separate areas, is something that's could be a concern, and certainly an indicator, and something to investigate. And then the list goes on. We might bring in, some threat intelligence to look at things like, anonymous IPs. We don't typically have, users that are logging into anything from, known Tor endpoints or anything like that, or known malicious IP addresses. And really the idea is there can be lots of different analytics that are tied to a specific threat activity, and that's, to be expected. And then I thought I'd give another example or actually show some analytics and how they might be documented. This one is, Windows account discovery. And one of the for those who have done pen testing or been involved in looking at pen test reports, a lot of times one of the first things attacker does after they get command line access or a shell on a system is they do some account discovery, right? What are the who are the domain administrators? What are the groups? So it's pretty typical to build, some analytics to detect that type of activity. So in this one, we're looking for, in particular, someone who is querying the Windows SAM user for domain administrators, and we can write an analytic. This one is written for Sumo Logic, which is a cloud-based analytics platform. I like a lot. Great platform for threat detection. We use it to good effect. And you can see that, in the analytics description, we have, a query that looks through Windows events for, a particular occurrence of, someone doing a lookup from the command lines of, who's in the, domain administrators group. So, just an example to show, how we can catalog the analytics. A lot of companies that are using analytics are, like other technologies that often don't get documented well, just rely on, the analytics platform itself to be sort of self-evident. Oh, I've built the analytic, I built a dashboard around this. Someone looks at it, they'll understand what it's for. They can see the analytic, within the platform. I don't need to document it. I prefer to have things, captured and well documented, what we're looking for, why, how, and there's some benefit to that. And then from there, we can build, real-time data visualization and alerting, and all the great things you can do, with the modern platforms as far as real-time mapping. You can see here, these are some things for SharePoint, specific things like, if we were concerned about the volume of page views or file downloads, using some machine learning for behavior anomaly detection is what's shown in these panels that show the graph with page views and files downloaded. The line in the middle is the actual occurrence of page views over a time period, and the thinner lines above and below with the shaded pattern is what's called dynamic threshold. So it's machine learning that's expecting, based on the history, what's normal behavior. It's not a static threshold that says, tell me every time this goes above 26, I want an alert. It's learning the normal behaviors of patterns for an activity, and then identifying and highlighting outliers to those patterns. And you can see the little tags here with triangles, or where the pattern deviates or outlies the expected behavior, and those are points of investigation. There's also, and I didn't include a lot of screenshots around other ways that we can visualize the analytics, but if we take this risk-based approach, there's some great ways that you can actually build dashboards around specific risks, and that's certainly a potential, but outside of this presentation, I can't get into that right now. So, one of the things we want to do is accelerate investigation and response. And when we know what we're looking for and why and how it relates to risk, there's just more opportunities to do that. One example is if we were looking for, like a pass the hash attack with a tool like Mimikatz, we might build behavior analytics around specific Windows event logs to detect threat activity. Here are some of the events that you can look at that would be indicative of Mimikatz activity, things like encryption being downgraded to RC4 and stuff like that. So we have these triggers, and upon detection, we'll likely want to run additional analytics to investigate and validate the threat activity, but also to gather relevant information for incident response, right? So for example, with Mimikatz, one of the things, a credential dumper like Mimikatz does is, it compromises every user that's logged onto the system since the last boot, right? Because the credentials were accessed via the memory of LSAS. So, if we did find that, this was real activity and was related to Mimikatz, one of the things we'd want to, potentially build and collect other analytics around is all of the users that have logged on since the last boot, because those would now potentially be compromised accounts, and we want to deal with them accordingly with potentially disabling and additional investigation. So there's opportunities for automation, for additional analytics, for potentially actions that we can take for incident response, and all that just becomes so much clearer, and we're able to build that model out when we put the process together of aligning to risk, and what are we worried about and why, and how does it affect the organization, and what specifically do we want to look for from a threat activity perspective, and how do we want to respond to that threat activity when we find it. So in kind of wrapping up here, the last thing we want to do is capture metrics and inform governance, risk, and compliance, or risk management. So one of the ways we can do this is, to sort of quantify threat detection capabilities related to risk. I'm showing a simple graph here over time. There's really lots of ways that we can do this, but an easy to understand example is, if we took a particular risk statement and we looked at the different phases of the attack. This one only shows the ATT&CK model, just to keep it simple. But we could give a score, like a 1 through 5 score to our detection capabilities across those different categories, and then map them over time and show how are we improving, how are we moving in the right direction to improve detection response capabilities. And this can be done for a specific risk. You could do it across all risks. You could take an in-depth look at how well you're able to detect against different attack scenarios or different risks, and that's all. It can be hugely beneficial, and it's great to be able to show management and senior management when they say, hey, how well are we able to really detect against phishing attacks, or I'm worried about something specific, exploit of the day type of thing, right? And rather than say, well, we've got pretty good, we've got defense in depth, got a lot of controls, we've got these technologies in place, which tend to be the answers when you don't have quantifiable metrics. We could say in detail, yeah, well, we're on top of that. We've identified 54 specific threat activities related to that risk, and 35 of them we have visibility into, and we feel like we're doing good, and there's opportunity to add more, and we've got a game plan to do it. And you become in a much better position to really understand your capabilities related to risk. The other thing, is as far as mapping those or communicating those is, I've seen people build heat maps with an actual risk and the different whatever model you're using, ATT&CK, and you can build heat maps against each one of those. Pretty effective too. And then the last piece is report metrics back to risk management. So risk management kind of informs priorities for threat detection. And in return, threat detection can provide back a lot of key risk indicators and key performance indicators. Things like threat event frequency are very interesting to the risk management team, right? Risk management wants to monitor residual risk and often is obligated to. And they want to understand control effectiveness, and things like how often threat activity is occurring is hugely important to the risk management team and can be very beneficial. So when we create this alignment, bringing these teams together can really be mutually beneficial, as well as all the benefits of getting the teams working together. So in conclusion, I know I'm coming up on time here. I do want to leave time if we have any questions. The benefits of risk-aligned threat detection, in summary, are better focus on threat activity that matters most to the organization. This one's interesting because I've talked with some folks about this approach, and CISOs say, well, I don't have the luxury to focus on top risks. I need to detect everything, and that's a fine perspective, and I'm good with that, right? But risk-aligned threat detection isn't about only focusing on certain risks. It's about prioritization, right? How do we prioritize building out detection capabilities, right? How do we prioritize when we're seeing a lot of different threat activity? What's the most important things to focus on first? And if we use this model, we really can still have the end goal to we're going to detect everything, right? And as we build this out, all we're doing is continuing to broaden our capabilities of threat detection. And as I said before, the type of detection that we build out related to specific risks, it tends to be much broader anyway, and applies to other types of risks as well. And then more context and clarity about detected threat events That just puts us in better position to respond more effectively and more efficiently. Opportunities to automate investigation and response activities, improved risk management program, and ultimately, the big goal which we're trying to achieve is reduce the time to detect and contain incidents. So with that, I will wrap it up and see if there are any questions that I can answer.
Great, thank you, Ryan. We did have a couple questions that came in. So the first one is this approach to analytics meant to replace SIEM solutions?
Yeah, so my perspective on SIM versus security analytics is complementary to SIM. It does not need to be a replacement for SIM technology. If an organization has a SIM system in place and they're getting value out of it, it's effective, then absolutely continue to use it, right? I talked in the beginning about sort of converging different technologies into a platform that can allow us to have some oversight and some centralization and take the parts and make them better as a whole. So SIM in my mind is another technology for security that can be brought into the analytics platform, and we can potentially do more with that data to get a data enrichment or data enhancement to the SIM. SIM platforms tend to be event-based, right? The event correlation is the hardest SIM, and although a lot of the SIM marketing teams will tell you that their analytics platforms, outside of some that are truly analytics platforms like Splunk that got lumped into being a SIM, but most of the SIMs are not analytics platforms, and we can do analytics and provide some threat detection capabilities with the SIM data that you just can't do in that particular tool. So we can take data from the SIM, and we often do this with clients. Is they have an effective SIM, we take the data, we bring it into analytics platform. We sort of do additional analytics or capabilities or data enrichment, and in some cases, we can return that data to the SIM. So some mature organizations that are have security operations that are built around a particular SIM technology that have been doing this for a while, and they've got automated processes and workflows and ticketing all built around SIM, and they want the information back into the SIM, so we can take the information out of the SIM, do threat detection, push it back into the SIM, and there's lots of ways to have that be a something that can work together well. And then I'll say lastly, if an organization doesn't have a SIM and really or isn't getting the benefit and value out of the SIM for the money, you can do a lot of the SIM functionality, correlation, event correlation, and things like that in the data analytics platform itself. So it could be the case that the analytics platform is used without a SIM and provides the same functionality. Any other questions, Jen?
One more. Yep, just one more question here. How do you test the effectiveness of analytics and detection?
Yep, so great question there. My background is a lot of time spent on the offensive side doing pen testing and red teaming and ethical hacking, and I find a lot of value in penetration tests, red teaming type of activity. And it's great to do those types of projects and test the effectiveness of security operations. Traditionally has always been done without them knowing, or a lot of times, you come in and do those type of tests without them knowing and figure out, where opportunities for improvement are. When it comes to actually testing analytics, I really like not the red team approach, but the collaborative purple team approach, where, we bring the ethical hacking team together with security operations. We look not necessarily at the full attack chain, but at specific threat activities that we've built detection capabilities and analytics for, and work together, with full disclosure to say, here's the threat activity we're worried about. Here's the particular analytics that we've built to detect that activity. Let's do attack simulation and advanced adversarial simulation around these particular threat activities and validate and verify that the analytics are working as we've expected. And if you get good ethical hackers in there that have visibility into how you're doing detection, they can often come up with creative ways to circumvent that detection and then recognize opportunities to improve it even further. So purple team approach is my preferred method there.
Okay, thank you, Brian. Otherwise, we hope that you found this webinar informative and that you'll be joining us for future webinar events. Thank you and enjoy the rest of your day.